What happens when top medical experts completely disagree in a case where every second and every detail could decide guilt or innocence? Today's courtroom exchange isn't just testimony, it's a battle of science, logic, and truth. And one key question could change everything.
Okay, back on the record, like everyone is present. I do want, before we get started, just to kind of let everybody know that I'm going to rein all of this in a bit. I think the questions that the Court of Appeals have asked me to answer, we've gotten past that a lot. The Rourke case got us here. All of the argument that probably is going on today is what went on there. They've already said, send it back here. I don't need to get into all of that again. What I have to do is take, and I get that the experts don't agree with you both. We're not going to try to convince the experts to agree with you. You can agree to disagree and then move on to the next question. All right. So I think we've taken a whole lot of time that probably is unnecessary for what I need to make my decision.
I understand, Judge. Just so I'm clear, I mean, does the court not, my intent with my questioning and testimony is to just give the court a flavor, an idea of the science upon which these experts are basing their opinion on. That's all.
I'm not going to, my intention isn't to hamstring either of you on what is important. I've already heard a lot, read a lot. I've started looking before this and during the short week we've had at some of the other information. I feel like a very, for my position, a very good understanding of what your positions are, what your experts pretty quickly are getting into now that I've heard several. So I'm not going to, I don't want you to take it personal if I say, okay, I'm good, let's move on, I guess. So try to do what you want to do. If I feel like it's helping me in my decision, I'm going to let you go. I might just kind of slow it down, stop it, redirect a little bit more than I have been so we can get through it. All right.
Sounds good.
Okay, perfect. Mr. Coleman, you may call your next witness.
Let's take called Dr. James Downs.
Thank you. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, ma'am.
Would you please raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're going to give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you, sir. You can have a seat.
Thank you.
And Dr. Downs, you can thank me later for what I just told the attorneys.
I'll thank you in advance too.
Mr. Coleman, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Dr. Downs.
Good morning, Judge.
Would you please state your full name for the court reporter?
James Claude Upshaw Downs, MD.
But you also go by Jamie, correct?
Correct.
Jamie.
That's correct.
Dr. Downs, you're back. Well, what do you do for a living, please, sir?
I'm a forensic pathologist, medical legal consultant. I also am the medical director for the physician assistant program at Charleston Southern University.
Are you board certified as a forensic pathologist?
I'm board certified in anatomic, clinical, and forensic pathology.
More than 33 years of experience in that area?
Actually, I tallied it up. It's 35.
All right. And are you also certified by the National Board of Medical Examiners and American Board of Pathology?
The National Association of Medical Examiners, I'm a fellow of that organization. I'm board certified by the American Board of Pathology.
How many states are you licensed to practice medicine in, sir?
Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama.
Have you been the chief medical examiner of the state of Alabama?
Yes, sir.
And director of the Department of Forensic Science for the state of Alabama?
Yes, sir.
All right. I think that's enough of the background. Let's please tell the judge about your involvement in the Shaken Baby Alliance, if you don't mind, sir.
So I am a consultant with them. I regularly do trainings for that organization, and I've known the executive director, probably 25 years.
And it goes without saying that you, over the course of your career, you testified in court before?
Yes, sir. Many times, as recently as last night.
Yeah. In fact, you're in the middle of a trial in California, correct?
Sir, they just released me at 7 p.m. your time last night.
Very good.
We appreciate you getting here.
And testified on as an expert on few or on many occasions.
Many occasions. I've been given sworn testimony in probably 20 states, also federal courts, military hearings, given sworn testimony before subcommittees of the U.S. House, U.S. Senate, as well as before the National Commission on Forensic Sciences.
And lastly, you've provided expert testimony in the Robert Roberson case out of Anderson County, Texas, correct?
That's correct.
That deals with the post-conviction writ involving a shaken baby case as well, right?
That's correct.
You've had an opportunity pursuant to the request of the district attorney's office to review a case file related to a deceased infant by the name of Kaylin Garner, correct?
That's correct.
Those records, if you recall, what did they include?
Transcripts, medical records, autopsy records, scene photographs, autopsy photographs.
And after reviewing those records, did you prepare an affidavit summarizing your conclusion or conclusions?
I did.
And by way of summary, if we could walk through that affidavit for the judge briefly, did it include a determination that there was an abrupt onset of physical signs and symptoms of massive acute brain swelling and unresponsiveness, along with pathologic posturing?
Yes, in a very young child.
A 2-month-old, in fact.
Yes, sir.
Could you unpack that for the judge? Massive acute brain swelling.
The brain got fluid on it and got too large to function normally inside the skull, puts pressure on the brainstem and shuts down vital systems.
Unresponsive and pathologic posturing.
The neural pathways are impacted, so their positions of the body, decorticate and decerebrate. That's what posturing means. It's just how your hands are positioned.
Based on your review of the file or the records, you also determined there was hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. That's essentially oxygen deprivation and or limited blood flow, correct?
Hypoxia is low oxygen. Ischemia is no blood flow.
And you also made a determination that there were retinal bleeds. How would you characterize those retinal bleeds?
Too numerous to count.
And the judges heard testimony about numerosity of retinal bleeds and it being multi-layered. In your training and experience, what are those things indicative of?
Well, they're not seen very commonly. The only place that we commonly see that would be in cases like this of what was formerly called shaken baby syndrome, now called abusive head trauma. In my world, multiple blunt force injuries. The blunt force would be an acceleration, deceleration.
And I want to spend just a little bit of time on the blunt force injuries, because to characterize that as blunt force injuries in the context in the world that we deal with in the criminal court realm, when we hear the term blunt forces, we think of like infliction of an injury by like a baseball bat or something that you're using as like a club or something to hit. You're talking about blunt forces in the context of acceleration and deceleration. Please elaborate on that.
Sure. So I'll give you an analogy, and this is not, because I know a lot of people do this analogy with motor vehicle collisions, but the blunt force is like what happens in a motor vehicle collision. By that, I mean deceleration. The body is traveling at 60 miles an hour and suddenly stops. I'm not equating this to that. But the blunt force is the acceleration, deceleration. The multiple is that it's repeated versus the baseball bat, a single strike. We're talking about multiple cycles of that repetitive motion that's angular. That is, it's XYZ axis, all three simultaneously.
And that's what's indicated by a retinal bleed that is too numerous to count and or that is multi-layered or that extends from the center of the retina out to the periphery. As
we understand it, that's the mechanism that's likely to cause that. There's no single diagnostic, what we call pathognomonic. That is, I see it and it has to be this, but that's where we tend to see this almost all the time.
You also made a determination in your affidavit that there were no atraumatic explanation for the condition of Kaylin Garner. What do you mean by no atraumatic?
Simply, this baby's brain was devastated by something, and there's no explanation to account for that. Babies' brains don't just suddenly explode. there's something that caused Caleb's symptoms and signs. And that something is, again, multiple blunt force injuries.
In the context of acceleration, deceleration injury.
Correct.
And you say there was no atraumatic explanation, but you understand from reviewing the case materials, there was an explanation given by the sole caregiver, the defendant in this case, Luther Garner, and that explanation was that he accidentally hit the child's head on the door frame.
Well, eventually, yes. I believe initially, no. That is also a sign that we see very commonly is remembered trauma. Usually when somebody comes in with a child that's obviously in a bad state, as providers, we have to believe the history that they give us, because the child's an extremist. And when we have somebody who doesn't remember trauma and then suddenly remembers minor trauma, like hitting a head on a door frame, there's a strong correlation, in my experience, of that kind of history with inflicted injuries.
And you concluded your affidavit by saying that in many cases, as in this one, retinal bleeds with severe brain swelling in the absence of subdural blood medically is confirmed as abusive head trauma. Is that correct?
Yes, in this case, yes.
All right. And I think you've already addressed the next point in my outline, which is the medical findings in total, in context. And you've talked about the remembered history. Is that how you characterized it?
Yes.
Remembered history. You talked about that. And then you also mentioned the abrupt onset of massive acute brain swelling, the hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, the nature of the retinal bleeds, and you have no reason to doubt that all of these things were presented to the underlying jury in this case.
I don't have any doubt about that.
And if I represent to you that the defendant took the stand at that trial and testified on his own behalf, do you have any reason to doubt that?
None whatsoever.
Do you have any reason to doubt that this jury considered all of those things in total, even considered those things possibly as corroborating evidence? Is there any doubt in your mind that was something?
I don't have any doubt.
And lastly, in that vein, is you understand how that, at least generally speaking, how jury trials work, in that these jurors can believe some, none, or all of what a witness says, and if they chose to, they could have disregarded this defendant's testimony in its entirety.
That's my understanding.
Let me move on. I think we've done enough or given the judge enough about shortfalls. So I don't know that I want to spend any time on that. But you understand studies, at least about that, about shortfalls and the theory behind it. Right?
Children can get injured from shortfalls, but not the kind of injury we're talking about here. That's very unusual. I did review one paper, and there was one case that ended in a fatality, which calls that whole paper into serious question about the methodologies employed, because biomechanically, my understanding of biomechanics, I'm not a biomechanical engineer, it doesn't make any sense that child would have sustained these massive injuries from a short fall. It's the one outlier and really calls the whole paper into question.
Very good, Dr. Downs. I think we'll leave it at that. And
that would be case number 8.
Thank you.
I think we'll leave it at that, and I'll move on. As part of your review, those records included reports from other doctors, a Dr. Fernando Stein, a Dr. Patricia Moore. I just want to briefly ask you whether or not you agree with, disagree with, would like to add to, or have any concern about their conclusions, particularly with regard to Dr. Stein and his characterization of the shaking of Kaylin being both violent and of an anterior and posterior movement, possibly multiple or repeated times, that caused the brain to shear the neutrons, to swell, and to bleed behind the eyes. Based on your review of the file in its entirety, would you agree with that, disagree with that, take issue with it, add to it?
I would modify a few things. First of all, it was neurons. I believe you said neutrons.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's the second time.
That's right. He said anterior, posterior, and I agree, but I think it's more the XYZ. So it's not just front and back. It's side to side, up and down, and rotating simultaneously.
Dr. Stein also characterized these movements as being fast acceleration and deceleration forces that would cause the head to move back and forth very rapidly. You agree, disagree?
I agree.
Dr. Stein also indicated that he was a pediatrician with the Texas Children's Hospital ICU unit with more than 25 years of experience. You have any reason to doubt that?
I don't.
And in your opinion, who is best suited to provide an expert opinion about shaken baby syndrome or abusive head trauma in infants? A clinical practitioner such as Dr. Stein, or someone who is, for instance, a biomechanical engineer or a law professor?
Living or deceased patient.
Well, that's a great distinction. I mean, as far as a deceased patient, I suspect I know what your answer will be.
I'm going to be for the home team. I would say a forensic pathologist would be best positioned. We would obviously work with clinicians. So an ICU doc sees these kids acutely while they're alive. So certainly a valuable source of information, and absolutely somebody who is alive, I'm going to listen to what they have to tell me. But after unfortunately passed away, then that's my area.
All right, makes sense. Let's move on to the reports or information provided by Dr. Patricia Moore. She concluded that, quote, some type of direct force to the head, whether it be a shaking mechanism involved or not, there was some type of acceleration injury to cause these problems in the brain and the eyes. You agree, disagree, take issue with that?
I agree, because there has to be some way to get this devastating injury. And without anything external, acceleration, deceleration is the only mechanism to account for it.
And when asked during the trial if these injuries were consistent with a closed head trauma due to shaking, her answer was yes. You agree, disagree? Based on what you reviewed in the entirety of the file.
I agree. It would be consistent with shaken baby syndrome as we termed it then.
And when asked at the trial whether or not this would have an immediate effect on the child, her answer was yes. And let me also add to this question, this whole concept of lucid intervals. If you can speak to not only whether or not you agree with her answer, but the controversy, if any, out there about lucid intervals.
So generally speaking, these injuries are devastating. It's apparent right away there's something wrong. What oftentimes happens is there's a delay in getting treatment for the child. So the child sits there and becomes more hypoxic and more ischemic. So more damage to the brain from those processes that are ongoing. Lucid interval, we are familiar with that with some types of head injuries. I can't say it doesn't happen, but it's very unusual. It would be an outlier.
You mentioned a delay in seeking treatment exacerbating the injury. Are you aware, if you recall from your review of this file, if there was a delay in seeking treatment in this case?
I believe there was.
I think that's about all on your affidavit. Let's talk about something that I suspect counsel for the applicant may want to inquire about, and that's how you are compensated. You're being paid for your expert testimony here today, correct?
I'm being paid for my time.
Yes, sir. And that's in the amount of $500 an hour, correct?
That's correct.
Plus your expenses.
That's correct.
Is that unusual for this type of situation or expert testimony?
Not at all.
And has the payment of your hourly fee and or your expenses in any way influenced your testimony today?
No, sir, I don't testify for a side. I testify for the truth. The truth doesn't have a side. I don't care which side is asking a question. I'm going to give them the same answer.
Very good. And do you, just to shore this up, do you or a close family member have a personal interest or stake or financial stake in the outcome of this case?
No, sir, not at all.
And in fact, you've signed a disclosure, a conflict of interest disclosure form, correct?
Yes, sir.
And I think the next topic here in my outline are case studies and clinical research studies. I think I'm going to cut that down, maybe delete it altogether. The judge has heard plenty about that from the previous witnesses.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Let me just see if there's anything in here that really lends itself to your area of expertise. Give me a second. Well, would you agree with this statement by the applicant's expert witness, the Dr. John Galasnik? You're familiar with Dr. Galasnik, correct?
I am.
With that he made on Monday, his sworn testimony was that there are hundreds of studies out there regarding shaken baby syndrome and or abusive head trauma. Would you agree with that?
That's fair.
That all studies aren't created equal. You would agree?
Oh, definitely.
All right, I'll just leave it at that. The judges are plenty of testimony on that. Dr. Glasnick also testified that for there to be legitimate shaken baby syndrome, there needs to be either a broken neck, a rib fracture, or some ligament damage. What are your thoughts? What's your take on it?
Well, actually, at one point in time, I would say there were a number of people in my community that felt the same way. In fact, I spent time looking at that specific question because people that thought there would be neck damage, they're really smart. So if they're right, I'm wrong. So why am I wrong? So I actually developed a technique of dissecting children's necks in shaken baby cases. And what I discovered in 100% of my cases, I found fresh blood and old blood indicating prior injury to where the spinal cord attaches inside the vertebrae. Now, other people have found lesser numbers, but in my experience, I believe that's real, and I believe it's a trauma that we don't normally see at autopsy because people don't normally do that dissection.
And part of what the judge is tasked with from the Court of Criminal Appeals is making a determination about whether or not certain science was available at the time of this particular trial. Is this what you're testifying to? Some new concept or scientific?
The concept of the spinal nerve root ganglia?
Yeah.
I started doing that, I think, in about 96. It probably didn't get published until the early 2000s, but certainly I was doing presentations on this in the 90s.
And along that vein, with regard to shaken baby syndrome in general, or abusive head trauma of infants in general, I mean, while there is this new theory of the mechanism that causes it, the science underlying that's shaken baby.
I'm sorry, a new theory of mechanism?
Yeah, the theory of mechanism meaning the shortfall or either something that mimics or maybe a rebleed, all of these things under this quote unquote new science, that may be a new theory of the mechanism.
I wouldn't say it's a new theory of a mechanism. We've had that stuff as long as I can remember. People have said you can get this from shortfalls. There's nothing new here. This packaging it up and painting it a different color doesn't change that we've thought about all this from the very beginning. I know when I was in training in the 80s and early 90s, I had cases, and I remember going through a differential that included things like falls, trauma. That's why the absence of trauma history is important. And that's really how you practice medicine. You use a diagnostic triad of history, physical, and lab testing, other testing. That is a diagnostic triad. Some people, when they're talking about shaken baby syndrome.
And I think I know where you're headed. We're going to get to that triad.
Okay.
It's part of my outline. But I think I want to circle back to something you just said about the concept of something being at least thought of or considered out there, at least in the world, in the sphere of what these cases were about. If that's your testimony, this is not these mechanisms are not something quote unquote new, so much as they were already around, being thought of, at least being conceptualized.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Ambrose Tardieu in the 1800s, 1870s, 1880s, first came up with the concept of shaken baby syndrome. You'll see a lot of people attribute it to other authors in the 70s, and they did write about it, but the concepts start back in the 1800s.
But I want to be clear, I'm not talking about the concept of shaken baby syndrome or the concept of abusive head trauma. And it was a hard concept for me to wrap my brain around. there is the mechanism that leads to the diagnosis, leads to the injuries and the diagnosis of shaken baby. Now, what I'm thinking of and what my question is, has that mechanism, the mechanism being either shortfall or some ailment that mimics shaken baby, or either any of those things, that is it fair to say that that's been advanced here recently or quote unquote new?
Some people have said it's new. I think the only serious disagreement or question is whether it requires an impact or not. Certainly, it's much easier to damage a brain with an impact. I don't think anybody will dispute that. The question is, can shaking alone cause these injuries? And most of the cases have an impact, so it's really not hard.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Downs. Biomechanical modeling, this judge has heard quite a bit about that. I'm not going to spend much time on it. In your affidavit, you saw fit to characterize relying on biomechanical modeling as malpractice.
I think there was more to the sentence than that.
Please elaborate.
To the exclusion of reality. That is, modeling is great. It's a tool. It's a wonderful, powerful tool, but it should not supplant reality. If there's some issue between agreement of reality and the model's flawed. So we're getting there. We don't have perfect models. They have to make assumptions. They have to do things like scale, which is take a low force on a little model and make that bigger because a human being is bigger than a rat. And they have to do things like switch from considering rat brains to considering human infant brains. So there's some assumptions that are made that are important to understand the whole process.
I mean, things like the details matter. Things like the strength of the neck muscles of an infant. I mean, that needs to be quantified. It needs to be taken.
I mean, take that. That's a really good example. It's not only the strength of a child's neck muscles compared to a lamb's neck muscles. You anesthetize the lamb, so they don't have the sympathetic parasympathetic nervous system that's going to stimulate the body. You have basically put them to sleep. Well, in a human being, in the real world, you haven't done that. And that's an important remember that the research may constrain or limit how the head moves. That's not reality. So all of those things are critically important when you're reading papers. There's great research out there, but we aren't there yet.
And I want to keep circling back to what was available, at least in thought, or at least in the common consciousness back in the early 2000s. And I want to make sure that because again, that's part of what the judge is tasked with, determining whether or not there's quote unquote new science out there. At least what you just testified to about whether or not it's an apples to apples comparison with biomodeling technology or science. Was that a concept in the early 2000s?
I really couldn't tell you. I'm not a biomechanical engineer. Certainly we had thoughts about doing models, but the modeling then was much more primitive than it is now. So I can't speak directly to it because that's outside of my field. I don't know exactly where they were.
I think you have answered my question. If it was more primitive than it is now, wouldn't it be a fair assessment that it would have been more unreliable than it is now?
Back in the day, I think as a generalization, that's probably true because we didn't have the detail and the understanding that we do now. But again, I'm not a biomechanical engineer, so I'm not going to pretend that I know that field.
Fair enough. Dr. Glasnick on Monday also theorized that a plausible alternative in this particular case was an epidural hematoma, the primary injury, that led to the secondary injury of an intracranial venous thrombosis, a clot that eventually was what caused the injury to fatal injury to Kaylin Garner in this case, and all of that came from the minor trauma of hitting the door frame by the father accidentally. What are your thoughts on that?
An epidural?
I said epidural. Am I incorrect in that?
I would think that maybe subdural.
Oh no. He specifically said epidural hematoma.
I don't really see that follows epidural. The skull is like a bony sphere, like an eggshell. And you know the membrane inside an eggshell?
if you are not certain whether shaking alone is enough to cause it, you would be in disagreement with Dr. Stein, who testified at the trial in this case, that said absolutely shaking caused this, nothing else.
I wouldn't be in disagreement with him. He's entitled to his opinion. I'm saying that I believe that shaking does cause the injuries that we see. We know that from research. The question is that all that's there? So I'm not in disagreement with him. I'm just saying the limits of what I'm comfortable with.
Okay, so you would not say it the way he said it if he said what I represented to you.
Well, I use a different term for the whole condition anyway, so different verbiage, different specialties.
Well, and that's an interesting point, is that you have, through your testimony this morning, said abusive head trauma, shaken baby syndrome, and then you have a third.
So one that I use is multiple blunt force injuries. I've used that ever since I had a case in the 90s that was called shaken baby syndrome, that I called shaken baby syndrome. And that ended up, through a lot of weird stuff, as being called a SIDS case. It's a long story, Your Honor. And I realized that people did not understand what that meant. So that's when I went, okay, why am I using that terminology when we deal with a motor vehicle crash? We don't call it motor vehicle crash syndrome. We call it multiple blunt force injuries. Or actually, with motor vehicle crash, it's singular blunt force injury because they only have one application of that acceleration deceleration.
So forgive me if I don't use your terminology because I can't remember it.
That's why I tried to use all the other ones.
Oh, okay.
So I will agree to use whatever you tell me.
Okay. But my point is that, you're the third doctor that's testified for the state in this case.
If you say so. I know
so Dr. Yu and Dr. Lindbergh have already testified.
Okay.
And the impression I got from them is that they don't want to use the terminology shaken baby syndrome.
Fair enough.
And that's in the pediatric community. Certainly, they try not to use that terminology. Do you agree with that?
Yes, and as I just said, I don't like using it.
Okay. And Dr. Yu, I don't know whether you know Dr. Yu.
I didn't. I just met him upstairs 30 minutes ago.
A young doctor recently out of training, and it appears that the training he's received as a pediatric child abuse doctor is, we don't talk about shaken baby anymore. And that's pretty consistent with what you understand is going on in that.
Yes. I think the terminology clearly has changed. Most of the pediatric community calls it abusive head trauma.
Okay, so and that is because they can't really say, just like you can't really say this was shaking or it was shaking plus impact or it was impacted. You can't really make that determination, is that correct?
Sure.
I'm
Get distracted there.
Yeah. That's okay. Get them to sit in the back row. Perfect. We're all good.
All right. Let me ask that again. Okay.
I think I got it.
Oh, you got it. Okay, go ahead.
So, like I said, there's a question about whether all of this can happen from just shaking alone. I have seen cases where I found nothing else. So based on my experience, I believe, yes, it can happen based on what I personally have seen. I know there is some question out there with different folks about whether or not it's required.
And that's a legitimate question out there. I mean, it's not an illegitimate thing to be questioning whether or not you need something more than shaking.
No, that's how we learn, is by questioning. That's what science is actually taking your theory, coming up with an idea, and then a scientist tries to prove themselves wrong. So that really how I end up making a diagnosis is, okay, I would say, for example, it's venous sinus thrombosis is our primary issue here. And then I would then go through a process of how do I eliminate that as the cause here? Well, it's easy because there's not any systemic infection. There's no dehydration. So I can eliminate that very easily. So that's how the process is done. Here, we've got this one question about whether or not it's required. And based on the limitations we have right now, I don't know that we can say with certainty. I can tell you in my experience, I've had cases where I believe were purely due to shaking.
Okay. And
I would say that was the minority.
I think one of the things you said that was interesting, you just said, based on the research, we just aren't there yet. And I assume you meant we aren't there yet to answer this question about whether shaking alone will do it.
To give a definitive one size fits all, this is the gospel. I don't think we're there yet, but I think individual experience, individual clinicians trust their experience. I've been doing this 35 years. I would like to think I've learned something in those 35 years.
So you have individual experience where people have their opinions based upon their experience, and then you have scientific research that's looking into this question. Is that right?
Well, you have the science of the practice of medicine, then you have research science, and human beings are not bench science. By that, I mean, we can't line up a bunch of test tubes. We can't take 10 babies and shake them and see what happens. So we use the principles of bench science, but we apply them to the real world. So I think the clinical experience, taking care of patients, my practice of examining patients is invaluable to understanding this. So I would say the best answer I have right now is I'm not sure, based on what I've seen from the biomechanical stuff, it causes me to question things, which is good. I like to be challenged. If I'm not thinking, then I'm getting stale. So I like to think. And right now, while my experience is I've seen it, I want to be more informed by the biomechanical community.
So you're not dismissive of the biomechanical engineers researching this area, are you?
Not at all, but you have to remember the limitations that in my affidavit, I listed several of those.
And in fact, the biomechanical engineers themselves, when they issue their studies, they identify these very same limitations. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. I just, in the trial I just came from, worked very closely with a biomechanical engineer, and the opposing side had a biomechanical engineer, and I value their input, their insight, just like I came up with the neck dissection. These people are smart. They're smarter than I am. So if they're right, why am I wrong? Again, that's how you do science. You learn from questioning and growing.
And so the biomechanical engineers that have done the studies concerning whether shaking alone can cause this, they're not like trying to trick anybody, acting like their study's perfect. They recognize their own limitations on what they could do.
That's a blanket statement. I don't know that I can say that for everyone. I have seen some folks that come up with some very questionable opinions.
Okay, but let's just talk in general. Biomechanical engineering is a legitimate field of science.
Absolutely, yes.
And it's a legitimate field of science when they do experiments and research to determine whether or not shaking alone can cause subdural hematomas, retinal hemorrhages, and serious brain injury.
Sure. To go back to what we were talking about earlier, the occipital or the back of the head shortfalls, that case number 8, the biomechanics is what tells us there's something bad wrong with that case. So that's a fatal flaw for that paper, in my opinion.
Well, let me ask you about that paper.
Sure.
I assume you and I are talking about the same paper, the Atkinson study, right?
Yes.
So that was a article or study, and I may have the wrong terminology of what to call it, but nevertheless, it was called Childhood Falls with Occipital Impacts by Atkinson, Van Ryn, and Starlin. We're talking about the same thing.
I believe that's correct. I'm talking about.
Okay, let me give you a second to do that.
I'm here.
Okay.
I've got Atkinson et al. Pediatric Emergency Care 2018.
That's right.
Yeah.
And do you know Dr. Atkinson?
I don't think so.
Do you know Dr. Starling?
I don't think so.
Okay, but are you aware that they're both child abuse pediatricians?
I believe that's correct.
And do you? And it sounds like you studied that paper to some extent.
So you were kind enough to give those to me, and I literally got them after 7 o'clock because I read them as I was getting to the airport and on the plane at whatever time this morning.
Okay, all right. Well, so that's not a paper you were familiar with before last night.
I can't say I wasn't familiar with it, but I hadn't gone through with a critical review like I did to try to come up with some things, and that stood out. That case 8 doesn't make sense in that paper.
Okay, but you understand that the cases that these doctors, these child abuse doctors, you understand all of the cases that they discuss in their paper were submitted to them by physicians who are members of the Healthcare Society.
I'm aware of that, yes.
And of course, and you know and I know you know the Healthcare Society is the child abuse pediatricians, essentially. And so, would you say that the Healthcare Society is a good source of information for these legitimate cases of short distance falls causing injuries?
Well, I mean, that's part of the problem here is the cases. For example, in this article, there's no biomechanical data. There's no measurement of the fall height. There's no reconstruction, no biomechanical analysis that was done. Didn't quantify head acceleration or rotational forces. So these are fundamental flaws with this paper. It's okay. It informs us. It gives us some information, but they go on to talk about shortfalls can mimic abusive head trauma or shaken baby, and that's not really true. Rarely. You can have subdural blood, one of that fake triad, and retinal hemorrhage, another of that fake triad. That can happen with short falls. That's true. But that's not a mimic of shaken baby syndrome. It's just two common physical findings. That's why nobody makes the diagnosis in isolation with physical findings. It would be irresponsible.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. So it's interesting that you are criticizing a paper written by two child abuse pediatricians based upon information provided to them by other child abuse pediatricians. Does that seem to you like that raises some question about the work and knowledge child abuse pediatricians have concerning these cases?
No, sir. It's a voluntarily submitted, and that's another problem. We don't have an N, so we don't know the number. We don't have a control group. I don't know how much research and publication they've done. I should, in fairness, I at the university used to teach how to do research, so I'm kind of a geek in that way. This is a good but small retrospective anecdotal. It gives us some information. It tells us that yes, you can have retinal hemorrhage. Yes, you can have subdural hemorrhage with a short fall. But that's it. And that's all I would take away from the paper.
Well, they also said that if these short falls had not been witnessed, there's a very good chance these people would have been accused of abusive head trauma.
So therein you have the problem with the witnesses. Some of the witnesses are just small children. And clearly case number 8 doesn't make sense. My experience has been sometimes people hurt children and then they don't tell the truth about them. So I have to question the veracity of the witnesses, honestly, especially in case 8.
And they also said, I think this was their bottom line conclusion, if a pediatrician or medical examiner is confronted with a child with a subdural hematoma and retinal hemorrhage and a history of a fall with occipital impact in the absence of other signs of maltreatment, accidental injury should be considered. Is that a legitimate conclusion for them to reach?
Yeah. Yes, I think you could actually remove several elements of that. Again, what we want to do is get to the truth, whatever that truth is. So I don't care if there's signs of abuse or not. If there's signs of abuse, I still would say, could this be purely from a short fall and we're seeing superimposed trauma from something unrelated?
So, I mean, this conclusion, this recommendation, that's something that they didn't need this paper in the medical community for medical examiners and pediatricians to know that they should consider an accident when there's a history of a short fall.
That's correct. I think that's common sense.
Okay, so I mean, essentially, when a caregiver comes in with a child with a head injury, and what they say happened, it is a history of a short fall, that should not be automatically dismissed.
No, and that's one of the areas where a biomechanical engineer can be a great asset to your medical investigation, because they can tell you, are the forces in this specific set of circumstances? They fell 23 inches onto concrete, no intervening surface. They can do that calculation and say there's insufficient force based on these studies to cause this type of injury. Hugely, or they can say, yes, that does explain, that could happen. So I'm not disparaging biomechanical engineering at all.
So concerning biomechanical engineering, the particular studies in this area, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe what they were doing was trying to determine whether or not they could replicate the types of injuries seen in shaken baby cases by their research with their models. Is that right?
Generally speaking, I would say in a lot of cases, yes, but I don't know about every single case. Again, I'm not a biomechanical engineer.
But what they determined was they could not replicate these injuries with their models. Even with they acknowledged their limitations, but with what they had to work with, they could not replicate it.
Well, there are some, for instance, another one of them, and I apologize if I have to look for a minute. It might have been Finney. I think they had some findings, something called amyloid precursor protein, APP, positivity. That's something that you can see. So there are elements that they can see that replicate some of the findings in shaken baby. But again, you get to the limitations of how it's done. You get to animal models compared to human models. For instance, a rat brain has lissencephaly. It's smooth surface, completely different from a human brain. So rats are not little babies. You have to consider the size differential and the composition of the brain tissue. So it's complicated, and we're getting better, but we got a long way to go.
And I'm not going to answer any questions about the Finney study because the judge has heard enough about it. But really, when you say it's complicated, what's complicated about this?
Trying to replicate reality with a machine.
Well, is it this entire area of determining whether shaking alone can cause the injuries in question? Is that entire area a complicated area?
In the sense of getting to a definitive answer, I would say probably yes, because we don't have a definitive answer. We have the best experiential information that we have, which I shared with the court. And I'm one of, 500-600 forensic pathologists in the US. There are way more pediatricians, and most of these cases survive. So I value their experience as well. And that clinical experience tells us that this is what happens in the real world.
But the clinical experience is one thing to be considered, and then the scientific research is another thing to be considered.
I think the medical science of clinical research is at least equally as valuable.
Okay. I will pass the witness.
Mr. Houston, anything else, Mr. Coleman?
Just one question, maybe to the.
Should I count? Should I start tallies?
Yes, one question was
Sorry.
whether or not there's a controversy out there in this arena as to whether or not shaking alone can cause the types of injuries that we've seen in this particular case. You understand that a jury heard all the evidence in this case, right?
Yes,
And that they made a determination based on the evidence in this case that the evidence supported that this defendant was guilty of shaking this baby, causing the fatal injuries by shaking this baby.
that's my understanding.
Is my second question. And based on, you're not here today to substitute your judgment for the judgment of the jury, are you?
No, I never do that. And actually, I did it several times this past month. I was on the stand for a week. I said, I'm not going to answer that because that, in my book, enters the purview of the jury. My job is to tell you what I know, what I don't know. And when I cross a line, I'm not going to cross that line because that, to me, certain things belong with the jury, not with me.
That's all I have, Judge. Thank you.
Thanks.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Any objection to the doctor being excused?
No objection.
Thank you so much, Doctor. You're excused. Have a safe trip.
Thank you. Sure.
My guess is that the next doctor is going to, which is our last witness, correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
So instead of getting started and stopping for lunch, why don't we take an early lunch? And then that way we can kind of go straight through that last witness. It's 11:20, 12:30. Okay,
Yes,
with both of you. We'll get started at 12:30. I'm sorry. Oh wait, I have a hearing at 12:30. Let's get started at 1:00.
Okay.
I have to take care of something else.
You need to clear off.
No, I'll make them work around it. It's just a short hearing. We'll probably just use the bench. So don't worry about
Okay.
packing up all your stuff. I know y'all are organized. I'll make sure no one gets involved with it, and we'll just come up here and take care of that one.
Okay.
Okay? So 1:00.
So here's the question. When science isn't 100% certain and both sides present compelling arguments, how do you decide the truth? Was this a tragic accident or something far more serious? Let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep courtroom breakdowns.